The Hawaiian sun had barely kissed the horizon when Commander Mitsuo Fuchida felt his Nakajima B-5N Kate bomber shudder through the morning thermals. Below him, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly, its surface broken only by the white caps that caught the early light like scattered diamonds. At 6:45 in the morning, December 7, 1941, the sky above Pearl Harbor was about to become a graveyard. Fuchida adjusted his flight goggles and peered through the cockpit glass at the massive formation surrounding him. 183 aircraft from the first attack wave darkened the sky. 49 Kate bombers like his own, 40 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, 51 Aichi D-3 Val dive bombers, and 43 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters. The sight filled him with a mixture of pride and dread that settled in his stomach like cold steel. The intelligence reports had been thorough. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's task force had approached undetected from the northwest. 6 aircraft, carriers accompanied by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku had launched their deadly cargo into the pre-dawn darkness, their flight decks alive with the controlled chaos of naval aviation at its most lethal. As documented in the official Japanese naval records, the attack had been months in the planning, with Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself overseeing the strategic details that would bring the United States Navy to its knees in a single morning. Fuchida's radio crackled with the voice of his flight leader. The formation was approaching the northern coast of Oahu, and below them, the island paradise awakened to what would become its most infamous Sunday morning. Palm trees swayed in the trade winds, and the white beaches stretched pristine and untouched by the violence that was about to unfold. The commander's mind raced through the attack plan one final time. Battleship Row would be their primary target. The heart of America's Pacific Fleet lay anchored in the harbor like sitting ducks. The USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, USS California, USS Nevada, USS Tennessee, USS Maryland, and USS Pennsylvania waited below, their crews likely enjoying the leisurely pace of a weekend morning. Through his binoculars, Fuchida could see the first glimpses of Pearl Harbor's distinctive geography. The harbor's narrow entrance, the fuel tank farms, the airfields at Wheeler and Hickam, Ford Island sitting like a green jewel in the harbor's center, all exactly as the reconnaissance photographs had shown. His heart pounded against his ribs as he realized that in mere minutes he would give the signal that would change the course of history. The morning air was crisp and clear, with visibility extending for miles. Weather conditions were perfect for what Admiral Yamamoto had called a date which will live in infamy, though those words had not yet been spoken. The American sailors below had no idea that their peaceful Sunday morning was about to become the opening act of their nation's entry into the greatest war the world had ever known. Fuchida checked his watch, 7:49. In 6 minutes, he would transmit the code words that would unleash hell upon the unsuspecting base below. Tora, Tora, Tora. The signal that would announce to the Japanese fleet that complete surprise had been achieved. At precisely 7:53, Commander, Fuchida's voice cut through the static of the radio waves. Tora, Tora, Tora! The words meant, Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. But to the Japanese fleet waiting tensely in the northern Pacific, they meant something far more significant. Total surprise had been achieved. The first bombs fell on Ford Island at 7:55, their explosions sending geysers of earth and debris skyward. The seaplane hangars erupted in flames as the Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers screamed down from 8,000 feet, their engines howling like banshees. The sound shattered the Sunday morning calm and sent shockwaves rippling across the harbor. Lieutenant Commander Logan Ramsey was among the first Americans to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. From his position at the Ford Island Command Center, he watched in horror as the rising sun emblems on the aircraft wings became clearly visible. Air Raid Pearl Harbor X. This is not drill, he transmitted, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around him. The Japanese pilots had trained for months for this moment. They knew every target, every approach angle, every defensive position. The Kate bombers, modified with specially designed 16-inch armor-piercing shells converted to bombs, targeted the massive battleships along the southeastern shore of Ford Island. These weapons, originally designed for the Nagata-class battleships, could penetrate the heaviest armor plating the Americans possessed. The USS Arizona became the first victim of these devastating weapons. At 8:06, a Kate bomber piloted by Petty Officer First Class Noboru Kanai released his modified shell from 10,000 feet. The projectile, weighing over 1,500 pounds, punched through the Arizona's forward deck and detonated in the ship's forward ammunition magazine. The explosion was unlike anything Pearl Harbor had ever witnessed. A fireball rose nearly 1,000 feet into the air, followed by a massive column of black smoke that could be seen from 20 miles away. The blast was so powerful that it lifted the Arizona's forward turrets completely off their mounts and hurled them into the harbor. Within 9 minutes, the mighty battleship had broken in half and settled to the harbor bottom, taking with her 1,177 souls. As referenced in the official U.S. Navy battle report, the Arizona's destruction became the enduring symbol of Pearl Harbor's devastation, her sunken hull remaining as a memorial to those who perished. On Battleship Row, the torpedo bombers were wreaking their own brand of havoc. The Nakajima B-5 and Kates had been modified with specially designed shallow-running torpedoes that could operate in Pearl Harbor's relatively shallow 40-foot depth. These weapons, launched from just 60 feet above the water, struck their targets with devastating precision. The USS Oklahoma, moored outboard of the USS Maryland, took the brunt of the torpedo attack. 5 torpedoes struck her port side in rapid succession, each explosion tearing massive holes in her hull. The 30-year-old battleship began listing almost immediately, her crew scrambling to escape as she slowly rolled over. Within 20 minutes, the Oklahoma had capsized completely, trapping over 400 men inside her steel tomb. Captain Mervyn Bennion stood on the bridge of the USS West Virginia, watching his ship absorb torpedo after torpedo. The explosions rocked the massive vessel, but Bennion remained at his post, directing damage control efforts even as his ship settled toward the harbor bottom. His courage in those desperate moments would later earn him the Medal of Honor, awarded posthumously, after he was killed by shrapnel from a bomb that struck the USS Tennessee, moored alongside. The harbor had transformed into a vision of hell. Black smoke billowed from burning ships. The water's surface was covered with oil fires, and the air filled with the screams of wounded men and the crash of exploding ammunition. Yet through it all, American sailors fought back with whatever weapons they could find. As the second wave of Japanese aircraft descended upon Pearl Harbor at 8:54, individual acts of heroism began to emerge from the chaos. The harbor burned with an intensity that turned the morning sky orange and black, but the American spirit proved as indestructible as the ships seemed vulnerable. Seaman First Class James Richard Ward was manning a machine gun aboard the USS Oklahoma when the first torpedoes struck. As his ship began its death roll, Ward remained at his post, firing at the low-flying torpedo bombers even as the deck tilted beneath his feet. When the ship finally capsized, he was thrown into the oil-slicked water, but not before his accurate fire had damaged at least 2 enemy aircraft. His actions that morning would earn him the Medal of Honor. At Hickam Field, Master Sergeant Emil Joseph Dvorak found himself in the middle of what the Japanese pilots called their second target priority. The airfield, home to the Army Air Corps, bomber squadrons had been caught completely off guard. Rows of Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses and Boeing B-18 Bolos sat wingtip to wingtip, making perfect targets for the strafing Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters. Dvorak watched in fury as his aircraft were systematically destroyed, but he refused to take cover. Instead, he grabbed a Browning automatic rifle from the base armory and began firing at the low-flying attackers. His accurate shooting brought down 2 Zero fighters before enemy fire finally silenced him. His determination to fight back, even in the face of overwhelming odds, embodied the American response to the surprise attack. The USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, became a symbol of American defiance. Lieutenant Commander Frances Thomas, commanding the ship in the absence of her captain, made the decision to make a run for the harbor entrance. As the great ship began to move, every Japanese pilot in the area seemed to converge on her. Dive bombers screamed down from all directions, their bombs tearing massive holes in the Nevada's superstructure. The forward magazines were flooded to prevent an Arizona-style explosion, but the ship absorbed hit after hit. Realizing that the Nevada might sink in the harbor channel and block it completely, Thomas made the agonizing decision to beach his ship at Hospital Point. According to the official Pearl Harbor attack report compiled by Admiral Husband Edward Kimmel, the Nevada's attempted escape became one of the most dramatic episodes of the entire attack, demonstrating that American resolve had not been broken, despite the devastating surprise. At Wheeler Field, Second Lieutenant Kenneth Martin Taylor and Second Lieutenant George Samuel Welch managed to get their Curtiss P-36 Hawk fighters airborne despite the chaos. They had been at an all-night party at the officers' club and were still in their formal uniforms when the attack began. Racing to the airfield, they commandeered the first two operational aircraft they could find. Taylor and Welch engaged the enemy with reckless courage, their obsolete fighters no match for the superior Zero fighters, but their determination unshakable. Between them, they shot down 6 Japanese aircraft before their own planes were too damaged to continue fighting. Their actions proved that American pilots, given even the slightest chance, could hold their own against the vaunted Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. The hospital at Pearl Harbor became a scene of incredible heroism, as medical personnel worked under impossible conditions to save the wounded. Navy pharmacists mate first class. John Harlan Willis repeatedly braved the bombing and strafing to carry wounded sailors to safety. When shrapnel from a bomb wounded him severely, he continued working until he collapsed from blood loss. His dedication saved dozens of lives that morning. Captain Casson Young, commanding officer of the USS Vestal, was blown overboard when the Arizona exploded next to his ship. Rather than swimming to safety, Young climbed back aboard his vessel and directed the firefighting efforts that saved his ship from total destruction. His leadership under fire earned him the Medal of Honor and demonstrated that American naval officers would not abandon their posts, regardless of the circumstances. The second wave of Japanese attackers found a very different reception than the first. American anti-aircraft guns were now manned and firing, and the element of surprise was gone. The price of the attack was rising for both sides. By 9:15, the harbor resembled a scene from Dante's Inferno. The USS Arizona continued to burn with such intensity that the heat could be felt a quarter-mile away. Her hull, split nearly in two, had settled to the harbor bottom with her forward magazine still exploding intermittently, sending columns of flame and smoke into the sky that would burn for 3 days. The second wave of Japanese aircraft, led by Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, faced a dramatically different reception than the first. American anti-aircraft batteries were now fully manned and operational, their shells bursting in deadly black puffs throughout the sky. The Bofors 40mm guns and the older 3-inch anti-aircraft weapons filled the air with a deadly curtain of steel that began to exact its toll on the attackers. Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki, commanding the Japanese midget submarine of 16-2, had been tasked with infiltrating Pearl Harbor itself. His mission was to torpedo any ships that survived the air attack and create additional chaos within the harbor. But the 19-year-old officer's submarine had been plagued with mechanical problems from the start. After running aground on a reef near Bellows Field, Sakamaki's submarine was discovered by Corporal David Akwe of the Hawaii Territorial Guard. The young Hawaiian-Japanese soldier, despite sharing ancestry with the enemy, did not hesitate to capture the first prisoner of war taken by American forces. Sakamaki's capture would later provide valuable intelligence about Japanese naval capabilities and their plans for the attack. The USS Shaw, in dry dock for maintenance, became the target of multiple bomb hits that detonated her forward magazines. The explosion was so massive that the ship's bow was completely destroyed, and the blast was captured in photographs that would become iconic images of the Pearl Harbor attack. Remarkably, the Shaw was later rebuilt and returned to service, her crew's determination to fight back unbroken despite the devastating damage. At Ford Island, Chief Aviation Ordnance Man John William Finn had been wounded early in the attack but refused medical attention. Instead, he manned a machine gun in an exposed position and continued firing at attacking aircraft for over 2 hours. Despite being wounded multiple times by strafing runs, Finn remained at his post until the attack was over. his actions earning him the Medal of Honor and demonstrating the incredible courage of the enlisted men who fought back against overwhelming odds. As recorded in the official Japanese naval aviation records, the second wave faced significantly more resistance than anticipated, with several aircraft being shot down by increasingly accurate American anti-aircraft fire. The USS Pennsylvania, flagship of the Pacific Fleet, sat in dry dock number 1 alongside the destroyers USS Cassin and USS Downs. The dry dock had been drained for maintenance, leaving the ships vulnerable to dive bombing attacks. The Pennsylvania took a direct hit from a 500-pound bomb that caused significant damage, but did not sink the great ship. The destroyers were not as fortunate. Both the Cassin and Downs were struck by multiple bombs that ignited their fuel and ammunition. The Cassin rolled over against the Downs, and both ships were consumed by fires so intense that their hulls were completely gutted. The sight of the two destroyers burning in the dry dock became another enduring image of the Pearl Harbor attack. Rear Admiral William Rhea Furlong, aboard his flagship USS Oglala, was among the first to recognize that the attack was real and not a drill. His immediate orders to sound general quarters and all hands to battle stations helped organize the American response. Despite his advanced age of 62, Furlong personally directed anti-aircraft fire from his ship's deck, his calm leadership helping to coordinate the defense of the harbor. The Japanese pilots, despite their initial success, began to pay an increasingly heavy price. 29 aircraft were shot down during the attack, with many more damaged. The American anti-aircraft fire, once organized, proved deadly effective. The Japanese had achieved tactical surprise, but they had awakened a sleeping giant whose capacity for both production and vengeance would soon become apparent. By 9:45, the second wave began to withdraw, their mission largely accomplished, but at a cost higher than anticipated. The sky above Pearl Harbor, which had been black with enemy bombers just hours before, began to clear as the last of the attackers disappeared toward the northwest. As the last Japanese aircraft disappeared into the northwest sky at 10 o'clock, Pearl Harbor fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the crackling of fires and the groans of twisted metal. The attack had lasted less than 2 hours, but it had changed everything. The United States of America, reluctant participant in the global conflict, had been thrust into World War II with a violence that left no room for neutrality. The human cost was staggering. 2,403 Americans had been killed, with 1,178 wounded. The USS Arizona alone had claimed 1,177 lives, making it the single deadliest ship loss in U.S. Navy history. The USS Oklahoma had taken 429 souls with her when she capsized, and dozens more had perished on other ships and at the airfields. Admiral Husband Edward Kimmel stood on the submarine base dock, watching the Arizona burn with an intensity that seemed to consume the very air around her. The Pacific Fleet commander knew that his career was over, that someone would have to be held accountable for the disaster. But at that moment, he was focused on the immediate task of organizing rescue operations and preparing for a possible second attack. The USS West Virginia, though sinking, had been saved from total destruction by the quick thinking of her crew. Damage control parties had counter-flooded compartments to keep the ship upright, and her crew had managed to beach her in shallow water. Chief Yeoman Edgar Beck led rescue teams that pulled dozens of survivors from the water, his boat making trip after trip through the oil-covered harbor, despite the continuing danger of explosions. At the Army's Tripler General Hospital, the wounded began arriving in overwhelming numbers. The hospital's staff, led by Colonel Ashley Williams Alderson, worked through the day and night to save as many lives as possible. The sight of young sailors with burns covering 70% of their bodies would haunt the medical staff for years to come, but their dedication never wavered. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage. Seaman First Class James Lawson, who had survived the sinking of the Oklahoma, wrote in his diary that night, "I don't think I'll ever get the sound of those dive bombers out of my head. They came down like screaming eagles, and when they pulled up, they left death behind them." As documented in President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's address to Congress on December 8, 1941, the Pearl Harbor attack had unified the American people as nothing else could have done, transforming a divided nation into a unified force dedicated to victory. The recovery effort began immediately. Salvage teams worked around the clock to rescue survivors trapped in the hulls of sunken ships. The USS Oklahoma yielded dozens of survivors over the following days, men who had survived in air pockets within the capsized hull. The sound of rescuers' hammers tapping on steel plates, answered by the tapping of trapped sailors, became the rhythm of hope in those dark December days. Captain William Dow Pulliston, the Navy's chief intelligence officer, began the grim task of assessing the damage to America's Pacific capabilities. 18 ships had been sunk or seriously damaged, including 8 battleships, the backbone of the Pacific Fleet. 164 aircraft had been destroyed, most of them caught on the ground. The naval base's infrastructure, from dry docks to fuel storage, had been severely damaged. Yet even in defeat, signs of America's resilience emerged. The Pennsylvania, though damaged, remained operational. The Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, the Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers, had been at sea and escaped the attack completely. The submarine base was largely undamaged, and the fuel storage facilities, though targeted, had survived. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Glenn Fuqua, the Arizona's damage control officer, had been blown unconscious by the massive explosion, but regained consciousness to find himself in command of the ship's survivors. Despite severe burns, he organized the evacuation of wounded sailors and the firefighting efforts that prevented the Arizona's fires from spreading to adjacent ships. His leadership in those critical hours earned him the Medal of Honor. The Japanese had achieved a tactical victory, but they had also made a strategic error of incalculable magnitude. By attacking Pearl Harbor, they had given the United States a reason to enter the war with the full support of the American people. The isolationist movement died in the flames of Battleship Row, and America's industrial might would soon be turned toward the single purpose of victory. As night fell on December 7, 1941, the United States was no longer a neutral observer of the World War. It had become a participant, and the sleeping giant was awakening. As dawn broke on December 8, 1941, the true magnitude of the Pearl Harbor attack became clear. The harbor, which had been the pride of the Pacific Fleet just 24 hours earlier, now resembled a maritime graveyard. The Arizona's broken hull continued to burn, sending a pillar of black smoke into the sky that could be seen from Honolulu, 20 miles away. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt worked through the night, crafting the speech that would ask Congress for a declaration of war. His words, "Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy," would echo through history. The president's voice, broadcast to a stunned nation, carried both the weight of tragedy and the promise of retribution. At Pearl Harbor, the work of recovery continued with grim determination. Divers descended into the murky waters of the harbor, searching for survivors in the hulls of sunken ships. The USS West Virginia yielded 3 sailors who had survived for 16 days in an air pocket, their story becoming one of the miraculous tales of survival that emerged from the disaster. The USS Oklahoma's salvage presented an enormous challenge. The massive battleship had completely capsized, her superstructure buried in the harbor mud. Naval architects and engineers worked for months to develop a plan to right the ship using a complex system of winches and pontoons. The effort would ultimately succeed, but not before the ship had become a symbol of American determination to recover from the attack. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, studying the damage reports from his desk in Washington, began formulating plans for retaliation. His concept of launching bombers from aircraft carriers to strike the Japanese home islands seemed impossible, but the colonel was determined to show Japan that America could reach across the Pacific. His plan would culminate in the famous Doolittle raid on April 18, 1942. The human stories of survival and sacrifice continued to emerge. Mess attendant First Class Doris Miller aboard the USS West Virginia had manned an anti-aircraft gun despite having no training on the weapon. As an African-American sailor in the segregated Navy, Miller was not allowed to serve in combat roles. But when the attack came, he fought with extraordinary courage. His actions earned him the Navy Cross, making him one of the first African-American heroes of World War II. The intelligence failure that had allowed the attack to succeed became the subject of intense investigation. The Army and Navy had intercepted Japanese diplomatic communications indicating that an attack was imminent, but the warnings had not reached Pearl Harbor in time. The investigations would continue for years, but the immediate priority was preparing America for war. Industrial mobilization began within hours of the attack. Factories across the United States started converting from civilian to military production. The attack had provided the catalyst for America's entry into what would become the largest industrial effort in human history. The same nation that had been reluctant to enter the war would soon be producing ships, aircraft, and weapons at a rate that would astound the world. As referenced in the comprehensive Pearl Harbor investigation conducted by Admiral Kent Hewitt, the attack had revealed critical weaknesses in American military preparedness, but it had also demonstrated the resilience and courage of American servicemen under the most extreme circumstances. The Japanese had succeeded in their tactical objective of crippling the Pacific Fleet, but they had failed to achieve their strategic goal of discouraging American entry into the war. Instead, they had unified the American people and provided them with a cause that would sustain them through 4 years of global conflict. The smoke from the Arizona would continue to rise for 3 more days, visible from across Oahu. But even as the harbor burned, American shipyards were already working on plans to build a new fleet, larger, more powerful, and more advanced than the one that had been destroyed. The attack on Pearl Harbor had ended America's neutrality, but it had also begun the process that would lead to Allied victory. The Pacific Fleet, though bloodied, was not broken. The carriers that had escaped destruction would form the backbone of the American response, and the lessons learned in the flames of December 7th would guide American strategy throughout the war. The date that was supposed to live in infamy had instead become the foundation of American victory. As the sun set on December 8, 1941, the United States was fully committed to World War II. The sleeping giant had awakened, and its first coherent thought was of vengeance. The road to victory would be long and costly, but it had begun in the waters of Pearl Harbor, where American resolve had been forged in fire and tempered in blood. The attack on Pearl Harbor had changed everything. It had ended American isolationism, unified the nation, and set in motion the events that would lead to Allied victory. The morning when the Pacific sky turned black with bombers had become the dawn of America's finest hour.